Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Leena Kashyap. I am the former Deputy Director and Emeritus Professor of the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. Today I am going to talk to you about the module on Social Work and Disability Studies in the course on Fields of Practice in Social Work. In this module, I am first going to talk about the changing contours of social work. Then going to talk to you about social work practice with people with disabilities. Then introduce you to what is disability studies. And last, talk to you about social work practice in disability studies. Some background details about social work. Globally, the profession, as you may be aware, is 200 years old. In India, the profession is about 70 years old. And basically, if by now you might know that historically, the purpose of social work intervention has been developmental, protective, preventive, as well as therapeutic. You also might know that the goals of intervention are improving the quality of life of human beings and addressing any external issues that are unjust or seek to create inequality and discrimination between different individuals, groups, and communities. In social work, the whole goal is to help people to help themselves. As you know, that the various tasks of social workers are securing change in the individual behavior, providing direct services, coordinating for provision of services by others, advocating for change in social structures, reforming government, legislation, and formulating new social policies. What are the methods we use? As you know, we use casework, group work, family work, advocacy, research, policy, community work, and social action. What are the roles that social workers play? A whole large variety. We can be counselors, therapists, clinical practitioners, probation officers, social care workers, youth workers, planners, and community workers. But today, as the profession has now attained globally 200 years and in India 70 years, what has happened is that our boundaries are becoming more fluid and less uncertain. Other professionals, newer professionals, have assumed control of many of the social work's constituent parts, and borders between different professions have become increasingly blurred and contested. For example, special education, which has come in late as a profession, has taken some of the work that social workers used to do with people with disabilities. No doubt it has taken the educational component, but it also works with families to educate families about what children with disabilities, how they learn, how they develop. Or if you take psychology, psychology, though it's an old profession, it also gives a lot of other aspects. You know, it takes on for instance, counseling. So the challenge for us, because the boundaries have expanded, they've become more fluid, that we have to also constantly change. Even our body of knowledge has grown, and there we have far more aspects, newer aspects, which to incorporate in our knowledge base. Also, concepts of diversity, systemic oppressions have now entered our professional discourse, which we never used to talk about earlier. Now, recent influences, the ecological systems perspective. So, what earlier it used to be much more the person with a problem, and the problem is internal to the person. Now, with the ecological systems perspective, we have begun to recognize that the ecology also plays a role in the problem faced by an individual. The systems that the individual interacts with, also systems such as the family, the schools or the workplace, or larger social institutions, also play a role in the problem that the person has. The human rights paradigm has also impacted our professional discourses, because we are no longer talking about needs of people. We are now talking about rights of people, that they not only need certain services, we are saying they are entitled to certain services. The feminist theory has also influenced our thinking and our discourses. And the anti-racism, oppression and empowerment analysis, as well as the postmodernist theory, have also influenced our thinking, and it has helped us in gaining a different perspective, with it newer skills. Now, as I don't know if you know, but social work is embedded in the country's policy framework. So, our current socio-economic political environment also has had a role to play in reframing our social work policies, our education, as well as our practice, in terms of influencing the goals, the priorities that we have, the targets for intervention, as well as the methodologies of social work. For instance, we are talking in this course on fields of practice. Newer fields of practice have emerged because of our socioeconomic political environment as well. Contemporary social workers need to challenge inequalities, injustices faced by marginalized, socially excluded, dispossessed, vulnerable and at-risk individuals, groups in society. One such excluded and marginalized group of people are people with disability, and we saw that in the last module. Now, social workers, it's not to say that actually right from since a long time, social workers have been working with people with disabilities and their families, especially in the medical settings. In fact, we've started working with people with disabilities right from the 1960s. Today, social workers work in a wide variety of settings with people with disabilities. For instance, hospitals, preschools, mainstream schools, special schools for children with disability, child guidance clinics, family welfare agencies, rural and urban communities, vocational training centers, just to name a few. The social workers are actually, rehabilitation is the work of not one profession, but the work of a multidisciplinary team. And social workers are key and vital members of this multidisciplinary team. What do we do in this multidisciplinary team? First of all, we act as a liaison between the persons with disability and their families on the one hand, and the professionals, the other professionals in this multidisciplinary rehabilitation team. And we explain the point of view of the professionals to the people with disabilities and their families, and explain the disabled person's point of view to the other professionals in the multidisciplinary team. We not only work with the disabled person, but we also work with the socio-economic, political, cultural and familial environments that pose a barrier in the optimal use of services by people with disabilities. We also work in partnership with people with disabilities and the NGO sector. So actually, the way we work with people with disabilities is not as an expert. We take on a far more partnership role with them. Uh, and in the NGO sector, we work not only in the NGO sector, we worked with the government as well. And when we work with the government, we are working towards campaigning for changes in public policies and legislative reforms for the development of local services and social advocacy for social justice for persons with disabilities. In the landmark judgments that I talked about earlier, social workers also played a role in reframing the legislation on rights of persons with disability. Now, initially, what was happening that because the social work with people with disability started in the medical setting, so social workers also took on the medical model of disability, and they looked upon the disabled individual as a problem, a dysfunction and deviance that the person had. They were commonly depicted by them also as people who were suffering, and the families were expected to look after them, but we also looked at the families as tragic people and having a traumatic experience with people with disabilities. So our targeted outcomes with them were also like that, that we had to help them to accept the fact that that they had a disabled person, to reconcile with this tragedy, so to say, to come to terms with their grief and loss, and that is associated normally with a mental or a physical disability. Now, all these old perspectives, especially the medical model, is being challenged, and the emerging disability, the emerging research, and the emerging knowledge that has come as part of the field of disability studies has brought forth a very alternative perspective on disability, which views disability from very critical lens, from a very different lens. And these developments have challenged this traditional perspective of disability as people who are victims and who are, to be pitied. Um, Now, so what is disability studies, which has brought about this alternate perspective about disability? Let me talk about that. But before that, let me talk about what disability is not, because very often it is misunderstood. So disability is not medicine, it is not special education or rehabilitation, it is not physical or occupational therapy, and profession, it is not any of the professions which are oriented to the cure, prevention or treatment of disabilities. So it's neither, it's not a medical aspect, it's not a medical discipline. Special education is a part of it, but it's not disability studies as such. Now, how did disability studies come about as a discipline? Actually, it was born out of the disability rights movement, primarily in the UK and the USA. And it gained momentum with the passage of the American Disabilities Act, which guaranteed civil liberties to people with disabilities as well. Till then, they were not treated, they were treated as people who did not have suffrage, who were non-people almost. So the disabled rights activists, that is the disabled people themselves, became very active in promoting their own cause, and they rejected the perception of disability as a functional impairment, and that limits the person's activities. They deconstructed the medicalized model of disability by locating the problem in society's failure to provide for people with disabilities rather than the individual's limitation. So they said that it is the society that is not providing the opportunities for the disabled person to live to his full potential. Is not just the disabling condition that is affecting the person. Now, the last few decades have actually seen a rise in the global disability rights movement and the family studies as a discipline. Actually, I must tell you that the four acts that I talked about in my first subsection, the disabled rights movement in India had a lot to do with the passage of especially the Rights of People with Disability Act. So the last few years we have seen a lot of research projects and practice models from a variety of professions from different disciplines in many parts of the world. A lot more professionals have got interested and involved in disability issues than were earlier. Disability studies has also in turn influenced a number of academic and practice fields. And one such field which has been very strongly influenced is social work. Now, before I go into how social work has been influenced, let me tell you a little more about what disability studies is. It's actually a very vibrant, diverse academic discipline that examines and investigates broad questions about the meaning, nature, and consequences of disability from the historical, social, cultural, and political perspectives. A distinctive feature of the field of disability studies is that it's both an academic field of inquiry as well as an area of political struggle against social oppression. In contrast to the clinical, medical, or therapeutic perspectives of disability, disability studies focuses on disability as a social, cultural, or political phenomenon or construct in terms of disability, how disability is defined and represented in society. And that's one of the reasons for saying that earlier it used to be handicapped. Society handicaps the person. The person may have an impairment, but it's the society which handicaps the person through their attitudes as well as their policies, which create barriers for them. This discipline is actually very interdisciplinary as well as multidisciplinary, and it is informed by all these disciplines have focused on disability and brought in different perspectives of how they view disability. Now, as I said, disabled rights activists as well as disability studies have brought in a different perspective of what is called the social model of disability. And this social model of disability challenges the way disability is constructed in society. It says that this social model separates the individual impairment from the disability and states that it's the built-in environment, the social relations, the dominant cultures that disables people and creates barriers, and not necessarily their own bodies or the impairment that the person has. So this social model has played a vital role in moving the disability policy from labeling people with disabilities to addressing the environmental and social barriers that exclude people with perceived impairments. So that's how the social model has also brought in the human rights perspective to this whole issue of disability studies. Let me talk a little bit more about the social model of disability studies. This model explores the nature of oppression and the fact that oppression is socially grounded. It works to lessen this oppression. And what is this oppression as far as people with disabilities concerned? It's the fact that they are treated as less normal than you and me. They are not given certain facilities and conveniences that they should be and that they are entitled to. This model also includes a blend of the strengths perspective, the environment, and resiliency to support in the individual relationship and societal change. Um, it it includes the strengths perspective, which says that yes, people have problems, but they also have strengths. And if we concentrate on the strengths, every person has strengths, and every person has the capacity to deal with their problems if they come to know about their strengths and they are able to use them to empower themselves. So this model and the focus in this model is on supporting, on modeling, and on promoting inclusion for people with disability in all walks of life, increasing their accessibilities to civil rights and improving their quality of life. So today what do we see? We see that people with disability are they have achieved some measure of educational integration. They have achieved some measure of vocational integration. What is very elusive still is social integration of people with disabilities in our everyday lives. Now, professionals in this field are involved, they are involved with theoretical research and educational practice, advocacy models as well, in order to remove the legal, physical, policy, and attitudinal barriers that exclude people with disabilities. So, as a social worker, what would be the role is to look at some of the, is to educate people about people with disabilities so that their misconceptions and stereotypes are removed. Because people with, we believe that if people with disabilities participate in the everyday life of the community, then not only they are empowered and they live as normal a life as possible, but even it benefits society as well because of the kind of achievements and skills that they will bring in. As far as disability and social work is concerned, there is, if we look at it very carefully, there's a high level of compatibility between many aspects of social work and disability studies. Let's look at some of these. Both have been historically integrating knowledge from arts and science courses. In your foundations in social work practice, you must have been told that social work takes from many social sciences, from political science, from economics, from sociology, from psychology. So we take from all these other different social sciences, so does disability studies. Both share similar perspectives and goals, that the disabling condition is not so much the physical impairment that the person has, but societal attitudes. Both uphold the principles of social justice, respect for human dignity, human rights, and equal opportunities for self-respect and self-determination of all individuals. We believe in the well-being of people, and we believe that both disability studies and social work have begun to question the fundamentals of both social service delivery and professional practices with regard to people with disabilities. So, not as objects of delivery of services, they need to, social workers have begun to question that they are not just mere objects of delivery of services, but they are people with equal rights, and we need to have a more partnership approach towards them. And both social work and disability studies have begun to recognize that it's really the controlling attitude of the professionals, the inadequate support services that are available for people with disabilities, as well as the architectural and attitude barriers that create greater oppression as well as discrimination rather than the person's impairment. And both emphasize that the solution to these problems consists of self-advocacy, systems advocacy, elimination of barriers, and outcomes chosen by people with disabilities themselves. What we are saying is that disabled people themselves are their own best advocates, and as professionals we need to support them and need to encourage them in their advocacy role. So both disciplines are committed to diversity and elimination of oppression. So we need to change the discourse from a discourse of dependence to a discourse of that the person can be autonomous if certain barriers are removed and certain facilities are provided to people with disabilities. So we do think that we need to empower them to believe in themselves, to find their strengths and to use their strengths. So given this high level of compatibility between these two disciplines, there is a wide scope for social work in disability studies. It's a very challenging field. And this field of practice uses the knowledge, values, skills acquired from both the discipline of social work as well as the discipline of disability studies. When we merge and when we use the knowledge that we have acquired from both these disciplines, the values as well as the skills, then what we are building is a very strong ethical evidence-based practice where we are focusing on diversity, when we are focusing on removing oppression. And so in this subsection, what I discussed was that how social work was was working more on the medical model, because social work started essentially in the medical settings. But as social work evolved and as new knowledge was synced into the field, then they started using more the social model of disability. So students, I hope you will also look at some of the readings that I have provided in this in the text of this subsection, and look at a little more on, read a little more about disability studies as a discipline, which would, and I hope you would think about becoming social workers or working in the field of disability studies as a social worker.